Okay, so welcome to another episode of New Energy Revolution. We're here in Istanbul, and I've got with me Gaetan Masson. Gaetan is an advisor to the IEA, and he also runs the Becquerel Institute. So welcome to the show, Gaetan.
Thank you.
Let's start with your talk today. I was listening to your talk; it was quite interesting. You mentioned some of the forecasts coming out by the IEA about the PV market share. So this is the photovoltaic industry for people that don't know. And give me a bit of intro about that. You know, what's your work with the IEA like, and how does that how do you do that research to bring up these models?
Okay, these are two different things. My job within the IEA is to chair one task of a specific research program that is called IEA PVPS for photovoltaic power systems, where we analyze the evolution of PV markets, industry, and policies. On the other side, the IEA is making a lot of scenarios on the future evolution of the electricity mix in the world. And the most interesting thing that has been published by the IEA recently is the PV roadmap until 2050.
Okay.
And one of the interesting elements of this roadmap until 2050 is that IEA has identified that PV could be, that solar could be the main source of electricity in the world in 2050 in a high renewable energy scenario, and that PV alone could contribute to almost 16% of the electricity demand in the world. And this is quite a tremendous achievement. When you see that 10 years ago PV was not considered as a mainstream electricity sources by most stakeholders, what the IEA has achieved this time is simply showing that the cost decrease of PV is so important, and PV is already competitive in a certain number of countries, in a certain number of market segments, that it's going to be more competitive than any other sources of electricity in the future, and PV is going to play a major role in the electricity mix of the future in a certain number of countries around the world, and I could even say in almost all countries.
So when you look at the penetration market share today, it's what? It's 2%, 3%? Where are we now?
PV represents 1% of the electricity demand in the world.
So we'll go from 1% to 16%, which is a 16-fold increase in 35 years.
What we can say is that for the time being, PV is still in its infancy. We have seen the way how the market has evolved in the last decade, which brought PV from almost nothing to the place where it is today. And indeed, this first % was hard to achieve.
Yeah.
Now the other % will be much more easy to achieve, providing a certain number of conditions, and one of the conditions is simply the access to financing. To basically redevelop the electricity system based on renewables, including PV, but also to electrify the part of the world that has no access to electricity. And we're still talking about 2 billion people. So there is a tremendous opportunity for PV to be one of the most important sources of electricity in the future, and to contribute to electrifying the part of the planet that has absolutely no access to electricity for the time being.
So we were talking about that in your talk. You were saying there's a few factors. It's not just grid parity, but what makes PV competitive. There's a few different factors. So you were mentioning, political risk is one of those things that if you have too much political risk, you can't get financing because the cost of capital, the perceived risk is too high. So maybe talk about that a little bit, what your research has shown in that, and why that's slowing down progress in some areas.
Well, I can summarize that in a very simple way. The most important driver of the cost of electricity, so the kilowatt hour that you will get from your system, is the cost of capital. So if you can finance your PV system at very cheap cost, the difference is tremendous in terms of LCOE, so the cost of electricity that you get, compared to a PV system that you would finance with a high cost of capital. And that's what we see in a certain number of countries today, where PV is not developing, not because of its potential, because PV is already competitive towards diesel generators, but because it's extremely difficult to find cheap financing in a certain number of countries for an investment that is supposed to last at least 20 years and even more. And so the question of the cost of capital is so important that basically you can double the final price of electricity if you increase significantly your cost of capital. So one thing that I advise in general now is that we can expect technical progresses in the coming years with regard to the evolution of